So in this video, we're going to talk about how to perform operations with imaginary numbers. Remember in the last video, we talked about how we now have this expanded number system that includes all of our complex numbers and our imaginary numbers. So what we can do is add and subtract imaginary numbers. And what we do when we add and subtract imaginary numbers is very similar to what we do when we combine like terms. What you're going to do is you're going to combine the coefficients and then include that I at the end. So for example, if we're doing 5i plus 11i, we're basically just going to do 5 plus 11 and then leave that I at the end. 5 plus 11 is 16, so our answer is going to be 16i. If we're doing 10i minus 4i, we do 10 minus 4, and then we leave that I on there. 10 minus 4 is 6, so we have 6i. So now you can go ahead and pause the video and try doing this example on your own. So if you're subtracting 14i minus 2i, you do 14 minus 2, which is 12, and then we have that I. So we can also multiply imaginary numbers. You're going to do this in two parts, and it's very similar to what we did when we were working with terms with variables. You're going to multiply the coefficients and then do I times I. Difference here is when we do I times I, we have a special result because I times I equals I squared. And remember in the last video, we said that I squared is equal to -1. So that's going to help us simplify our answer even further. For example, if we do 4i times 7i, we do 4 times 7, which is 28, and then we have I times I, which is I squared. So I squared is -1, so this is going to become 28 times -1, which is -28. So let's try this example. Let's try multiplying 4i times -3i. So I'm going to multiply the coefficients, 4 times -3, and then I'm going to do I times I as my second part. So 4 times -3 is -12. I times I is going to be I squared. Well, we know that I squared is -1, so we have -12 times -1, which is equal to +12. Now let's multiply -9i times -10i. So I'm going to pull out the coefficients, -9 times -10, and then we have I times I. And so let's simplify this. So -9 times -10 is 90. I times I is I squared. Well, so we have 90 times I squared. Well, we know that I squared is -1. 90 times -1 is -90. So now you can go ahead and pause the video and try doing this example on your own. So we have 5i times -2i. So we're going to pull out that 5 times -2, which gives us -10. And then I times I gives us I squared. So I squared is -1, so we have -10 times -1, which is +10. So now let's work on this problem. So this is an interesting problem because it doesn't have our terms already written in terms of I, but we can use what we learned in the last video to go ahead and do that. So for example, the square root of -20, I can rewrite as the square root of 20 times the square root of -1. And then I can think about how I can make this better. Well, the square root of 20 I can turn into the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, and that square root of -1 is going to become I. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, so I have 2 times the square root of 5, and then I have I. Now let's work on the square root of -12. Well, I can rewrite that as the square root of 12 times the square root of -1. The square root of 12, well, I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, and that square root of -1 is going to become I. The square root of 4 is 2, so we have 2 times the square root of 3, and then we have I. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply the coefficients together, and then I'm going to multiply the i's together. So I have 2 square root of 5 times 2 square root of 3, and then I have I times I. So 2 square root of 5 times 2 square root of 3, I'm going to multiply 2 times 2, which is going to give me 4. And then under the square root, I have 5 times 3, which is 15. And then this I times I, well, that's going to become I squared. Remember that I squared is -1, so this is going to become 4 square root of 15 times -1. So my final answer is going to be -4 times the square root of 15. So remember, you can add imaginary numbers by combining the coefficients. You can multiply imaginary numbers by multiplying the coefficients and using the fact that I squared equals -1 to simplify.